Great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. My name is Erin. I'm ACRL's content strategist, and this is using ACRL's Fostering Change Guide in your library. If you haven't had a chance to look at the guide yet, it's openly available at bit.ly.com/ACRL Fostering Change, and I'll drop that link into the chat as well. As Eloish mentioned, today's session is being recorded, and we'll post the recording on ACRL's YouTube channel and link to it from ACRL's website. Please make sure your chat box is set to go to all panelists and attendees and add any questions you have throughout the presentation. I'll collect questions from chat as they come in and moderate the questions at the end of the session. I'd like to thank today's presenters and the authors of Fostering Change: Brianna Marshall, Director of Research Services at the University of California, Riverside Library; Dani Brecher Cook, Director of Teaching and Learning at the University of California, Riverside Library; and Cinthya Ippoliti, University Librarian and Director for the Community College of Denver, Metropolitan State University of Denver, and University of Colorado, Denver. After my introduction, I'll turn the presentation over to members of ACRL's New Roles and Changing Landscapes Committee to talk a little bit about the need they saw for this project and its development. They are Erin Smith, Chief Information Officer at Westminster College; Mark Emmons, Associate Dean for the University Libraries and Learning Sciences at the University of New Mexico; and Liz Chabot, College Librarian for Ithaca College. Finally, this free webcast and ACRL's other free professional development opportunities are made possible in part by your ACRL membership, which helps fund many of our programs and services for the academic and research library community. Not a member? Join nearly 10,000 of your colleagues and become a member today. Visit ala.org/ACRL/membership for more information. Erin, Mark, and Liz, feel free to start when you're ready.
Thanks, Erin, number one. My name is Erin Smith, and I just could not be more excited about this webinar and the work that the authors have done on this guide. Believe it or not, this is a work that is almost 4 years in the making. Not in the writing. Once the authors got involved, it went really fast. But in conceptualizing what this work should be, we've been thinking about it and thinking about what to do for quite a while. This particular work in this particular direction, because some of you may be wondering, thinking, why on earth there would be yet another work on organizational change. And that's something that our committee talked about a whole lot in the beginning, because there is a lot of good stuff out there. But in an informal conversation Mark and I had way back at ACRL, note it was informal, no business officially being conducted in Baltimore a few years ago, I was sharing my story and how I got really involved in organizational change. And I don't know that it was the same path as a lot of my colleagues. I was pretty new as a library director, and at a library director at a small private school. So not particularly well resourced. And I had the unusual circumstance of about half of my staff retiring in a 2-year period. So we're small, so it's 4 people out of 8, not 50 people out of 100. But I had an amazing staff, and really that experience was and still is one of the highlights of my professional career. But what I found out later, after we went through a pretty successful process and redefined roles and did lots of research about where we thought library trends were going, is that I probably could have done it a lot better had I known there was a body of literature out there about organizational change. So in this informal conversation, as I was, kind of sharing my story and how I got there, Mark, and then later Liz and a bunch of other people on the committee really brought the theoretical framework, and we thought that despite everything out there that there is to read about organizational change and all of the great experiences that already exist, there wasn't really anything that was designed for library teams to do together. So not just, the great new library director that you hire in that makes lots of change, and that's definitely an effective and great model, or the model where you bring in a consultant. But this is really for the folks that, are at a library and see an opportunity to make change and want to do that within themselves and as a group. And there really aren't many opportunities that are free, right, in life, period. So the fact that this would be a no cost resource available to teams of libraries who aren't well versed in the literature, maybe you don't know it even exists, you know, people like me, embarrassingly now. We really thought that despite everything out there, that there was a gap and a real need, and hopefully you'll see that too. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to talk a little bit about how it actually came to being.
Right, thank you, Erin, and free like puppies, right? Because there's work involved in this workbook. So at the time, I was chair, and Jill Gremmels was past chair of the committee, and Erin was on the committee. The committee we're talking about is the New Roles and Changing Landscapes Committee of ACRL. And the idea that Erin and I brought to the committee was embraced, and so we formed a subcommittee. Also on that committee was Dane Ward. And so we just sat around and we had different backgrounds. We were all leaders of one sort or another. I was an associate dean. Everyone else was a dean or director of their libraries. I had a background in educational leadership with a doctorate in that, and then so did Dane. And so we brought our various connections together, our various knowledges together, and we created an outline. But we determined that we really weren't the right people necessarily to put it together for time constraints. And we asked Erin about charging a group to do this work. And so we shared that outline with them, and we became what is known as SMEs. But I'm going to turn it over to Liz for the third part of this right now. Oh, by the way, Jill's here today too. So she's not presenting, but she's part of the audience. So, hey, Jill. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who could talk a little bit about SMEs and about the process that we did working with our authors today.
Right. Repeating a little bit what's already been said, I think when our working group began to create a guide structure, we identified change models, theoretical frameworks with which we'd had some working knowledge or experience. We then interviewed SMEs, subject matter experts, selected folks that we were aware of that were kind of leaders in the academic library field. And I think one thing we realized was that, and these were people who'd led change efforts in their libraries. I think we discovered that change efforts are really uniquely time and place based, and we didn't draw any themes or threads that we could use across all of the SMEs that we talked to. And I think we also realized that we were SMEs. I still don't think of myself as a SME, but we did have experiences in leadership and leading change. But we did not have what I would call the bandwidth to create a fully developed change guide. And so we were really pleased when ACRL allowed us to do an RFP, and we selected a team of curriculum designers. And I think they've produced an excellent and an engaging guide. I particularly appreciate the inclusion of individual change stories from all types of academic libraries. I think that really enhances the usability of the guide. And as the designers quote, Heraclitus, change is the only constant. And certainly none of us anticipated the new normal in which we find ourselves. And many of us are examining our service delivery, our resource discovery models, and I think that's making this guide even more useful than we anticipated in 2017. So I am now going to turn the session over to Dani, Brianna, and Cinthya.
All right, and I'm going to kick things off on our side. Thank you so much to Erin and the committee members for that wonderful introduction. Dani, if you could go to the next slide, please. So this is us. Well, that was us. And you can also see us probably. I think we all have our cameras on still. But Erin gave a really wonderful introduction to the three of us. So we're going to, in the interest of time, skip on ahead. Thank you. So what are we going to be talking about today? We only have an hour. And obviously, there's so much that we could spend this time unpacking. Frankly, we could talk about any one of the topics that we're going to give like a slide long overview, and we could use this time well. But we want to give a little bit more of an introduction to this project. We want to walk you through the sections and some example exercises from the actual guide. And what are our next steps for the project? Keep that in mind, think about that, very mysterious. And then of course, have time for a Q&A. And Erin, I know that you mentioned that you'll be moderating the chat. I'll also say that only one of us will be speaking at a time, so we can also probably be watching that chat and responding to some of the quicker questions as well. Next slide, please. All right, how did this project begin? The committee members did an excellent job of giving some of that context about how we were brought in. And we really took to heart, the guidance that they provided. And one of the things that we had to get to pretty much initially when we got together, when Cinthya, Dani, and I were selected, what do we want this resource to look like? There were a few different options that were on the table. Should this be a course of some sort where there are modules that people can work through? Should this be a document format? And we really needed to dig into what we wanted people to be able to get out of this and sort of how this would be differentiated, as some of the committee members have already spoken to, from the other things that are out there right now related to organizational change in academic libraries in particular. We really wanted people to be able to interact with, engage with, and also modify the work. That was something that was really important. We were aware that we were only, 3 voices, and that there are so many different valuable perspectives in this area. We really wanted it to be rooted in the practicalities of change management, which sometimes differ significantly from the theory of change management. And in particular, I remember talking to Dani and Cinthya about how, we'd have these conversations about change at conferences, pulling someone aside and kind of dishing about, change gone wrong and the implications that has had on morale and on, the work that we're trying to build toward. And we wanted to bring in some elements of that kind of conversational tone into this guide, so that it wasn't necessarily just detached and saying, prescriptive, you should do this, you should do that, because there's a lot more to unpack and there's a lot more related to our individual organizational contexts that should be considered. We wanted this to be able to be completed as an individual or as a group. So the team-based focus is definitely front and center. But even if you're an individual who's just interested in change management, you can pick up this guide and you can, go through it and you can read about change. And we hope that it will also be useful to you. And then, of course, having a guide that's useful for both organizations that know what change they want to make. Perhaps it's very specific. You already have a really good idea of the scope of the change that needs to happen or that you want to happen. Or maybe you're just aware that something has to change and maybe you're not sure what has to change. We wanted this to be something that was useful for both of those scenarios. So as we had these conversations about what made the most sense, we settled on an openly available, openly licensed guide that would have generally the following content. So broad topical sections, breaking down what are the core elements of change that you would want to think about. And we tried to think about that in roughly a chronological, oriented way. Although we realized that some people might pick up in the middle of the guide and that's the most useful place for them to start. So it is modular in a sense where if you're most interested in section 4, you can start there and you can kind of bounce around as you wish. We wanted to include exercises, again, as a means to share out the information about these core elements of change, but also then to say, hey, consider this in your context. Consider this as an individual, reflect on this, and also then work on this with your team. So we have sort of a mix of individual and team exercises. Resources for further information. We were not looking to recreate the wheel in making this guide. There's a lot of really wonderful resources that are out there. So we tried to point to those throughout. And then, as Liz mentioned, we have some change stories from the profession. We did an open call where we invited people to share those change stories, both good and bad, with us as a way to illustrate how change is happening in libraries. And really it goes along with the person-focused person-focused approach that we took with this guide, which is a great segue for the next slide, which Dani will be walking us through.
Thanks, Brianna. Yes. So hi, everyone. I'm Dani Cook, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the core values of this project that led us through creating the text, and that I think hopefully you'll see as you work through the guide itself. And so one of those central values, as Brianna just mentioned, is a person-centered approach, meaning that change obviously affects individual people very differently, and it very much depends on their personal experiences, their strengths, maybe their perceptions of their weaknesses, their feelings, and all of that really plays into how successful your change can actually be. And so from our own experiences, as well as the experiences of the committee and the folks who sent their change stories in, we knew that this was something critically important for us to include, this focus on how change is going to affect folks within the library structure. So throughout the text, you'll see calls for centering empathy for those who are interacting with the change, who are enacting the change, and asking you to try and understand both where you're coming from and where all the other folks in your institution may be coming from as well. Not that you can please everyone ever, but just coming from a place of trying to make space for people to have their feelings about how change is affecting them and creating that space for authentic reactions. So some of the exercises within the text specifically speak to this, and we'll show some of those today. As Brianna mentioned, we wanted this guide to be practical and flexible. So it is Creative Commons by NC license, so that you can remix it yourself for however you need, and you can start wherever you think is the best place for you within this guide. It's also meant for people across the library to find useful. So often leadership texts and change texts are aimed at people in administrative type positions or in director or dean roles. And we really thought that anyone can create change, everyone can be an instigator for change. So you'll see lots of examples throughout the text of folks in every level of the library creating those changes. And then crucially, especially 2020, we wanted to bring an equity and inclusion perspective as well. So there are some explicit discussions of power dynamics, because change, of course, has many implications for that, who creates it, who is able to enact change, et cetera. So that's going to be discussed in the text too, and you will see that. And then especially the inclusive perspectives embedded within our exercises. So we hope that these values resonate with you, and you'll see them again throughout the text.
Great. Hi, everyone. This is Cinthia. So Dani and Brianna already touched on this a little bit, but just a couple of quick tips to kind of get you started thinking about how you might utilize this guide within your own libraries. So again, as we mentioned, you can go through the entire book in sequence, or you can focus on the parts that are most useful, most appropriate. That's basically, we try really hard to make sure that you didn't really need one part before moving on to the next, although it is helpful to kind of go through that entire progression. And as we've also mentioned, exercises can, of course, be done individually or in groups. And we've created, there's an appendix that gives you kind of an at-a-glance overview of all the different exercises and how you can kind of go through each one of them. And then finally, this would really hopefully be the opportunity, if you're not in library administration, to be able to approach library leadership with the idea of what are we talking about when we're talking about change within the organization, and what do we mean, and are there elements that might be considered for the library to start thinking about if change is not necessarily kind of front and center, or if there's sort of a desire to try out some different things and sort of see what happens. And so that's kind of our invitation to you to see how these, how these different perspectives might play out as to how you might apply them in trying to get started with your own change effort. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dani.
Sorry, had a challenge unmuting myself there. So we're going to take a little turn now to walking you through the sections of the guide. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you'll find in each section, how it might be useful, and give you an example of an exercise from each of those sections. So I will kick us off with the first section, which is called Exploring Your Role as a Change Agent. So as I talked about a little bit earlier, one of the goals of this guide is to make everyone understand and feel empowered to be a change agent in their library, no matter their position. So this is sort of a conceptual section, and we encourage folks to reflect on both themselves and their institution during this section. So the specific areas that you'll find in the first part of the guide talks about who leads change, what that kind of looks like, some considerations of those power dynamics based on whether you're a person who is maybe lower on the organizational chart or someone who has a lot of administrative privilege in the organization, and some considerations for people in kind of both of those areas. We talk a little bit about leadership styles, and then give you some examples of other places to go to sort of dive in if you'd like to learn more about specific leadership styles. I know there's many out there, so we've selected some that are the most common, and some that we just thought were more interesting and that aligned with some of our values for the text to explore. And then a reflective area for considering your role within the change process and what you'd like that to be and what your strengths might be and where you might have some room for growth. Which brings me to the first exercise that we're going to share with you today, which is called Know Yourself. So as I think Brianna mentioned, we have exercises throughout the guide that some are meant for individuals to complete on their own and some are meant for groups to complete on their own. So this is actually an individual exercise for folks to reflect on their values for the change process. Again, thinking about how they like to receive feedback, their feelings towards change in general, things of that nature, to really sort of set the stage for how a change might look, to start to understand how change affects different people, starting with yourself, and then sharing that out with your change group as you put that together. So this is sort of a fundamental foundational exercise that we recommend. And it is, I think, indicative of the whole section. Then in section number 2, so in the first section, we don't even necessarily talk about like, what is your change? We just think about the process of change and who leads change. And in the second section, we start to imagine what changes could be. So again, as Brianna mentioned, this guide is for folks who both kind of know very specifically what kind of change that they want to make in their organization, whether that's they want to do like a large departmental reorganization, or they want to change a service or something that could be much smaller. This section can lead you through that process, especially if you are not 100% sure what that change is that you're looking to make. So the first subsection in this area is about dreaming. So imagining the possibilities, taking some ideas from the design thinking process to, before you kind of land on your final decision of what you're wanting to do, to imagine what's possible and how you might get there. Then we enumerate some change elements for consideration in any change process, such as who's going to be a leader, your communication plan, the capacity within your library to undertake different kinds of change. We'll talk more about that. The resources that are available to make change. So for example, you might have this great idea for like a very technologically heavy change, but if the resourcing isn't there, how might you change your framing or set that aside for later, et cetera, and then the structures and processes that you would need in order to create your change. So this starts to get into the specifics of the change work, which we then follow up in the next couple sections, which I think Cinthya is going to be telling you about. So the first exercise in this section, again, sort of conceptual, we call it Dream a Little, meant to be an individual exercise first and then shared with your change group. And thinking about the group strengths, individual strengths, an idealized future, what might that look like? And again, this is particularly helpful for those who maybe don't have a specific idea yet of what that change that they're looking to make is.
Great. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the specific activities that you can undertake once you do know you have a better sense of the kind of change that you would like to make. And so the graphic there, before I kind of delve into the other areas that are listed here, is talking a little bit about kind of that readiness for change that Dani just touched on. So thinking about all the different resources and elements needed and trying to figure out kind of where your organization is to help you prepare for that change. So once you know what that change is, or you have a better idea of the direction you'd like to take that in, we split up this section really into two parts. So starting first with the internal strategies, which are really looking inward. So it's starting by looking within the library and saying what kinds of sort of self-assessment can we undertake to let us know kind of the direction we might want to go in. So futures thinking is thinking a little bit about not trying to predict the future, because unfortunately none of us could do that, but trying to say, if there's sort of this kind of fuzzy future just out of reach, how might we get there? And thinking through what those activities might look like to kind of help the library think through that. And that's especially great if you're interested in doing things like strategic planning as part of this work. Self-studies, those are pretty broad, and those can entail anything from looking kind of across the whole organization or focusing on a particular area, for example, collections or something like that. Climate surveys, so this is looking at the organization, kind of how staff morale and how folks are feeling and what are the issues that need to be dealt with, and sort of kind of what's going on in the organization. Process mapping and service blueprinting are kind of related, and they refer to some specific kind of assessment of your perhaps services or a specific workflow that you might be interested in kind of examining a little bit more closely and thinking about how it might be changed. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so moving on to the external strategies, these are the strategies that the library can undertake in collaboration with stakeholders. And this is really the idea that you are not doing something to the stakeholders, but you're working with your stakeholders in concert to develop these strategies. And so it's really thinking about developing that stakeholder engagement framework. So how do you want to work with stakeholders? And of course, there's a wide variety of stakeholders and who might have different needs and sometimes competing needs. And how do you kind of account for all of that? Really thinking through ethnographic approaches, user experience, and equity-centered design, which again, all of those get at how do you work with these individuals and these groups. And so ethnographic approaches encompass everything from doing things like drawing, doing observation studies, space studies, really trying to understand kind of where the user and the stakeholders coming from. User experience activities is not just about kind of a digital, how do people, for example, navigate the website. User experiences is heavily used in that context, but really more broadly. So again, what kind of original research might you undertake, for example, with students that might yield some interesting results? And then equity-centered design is sort of a play on design thinking, which kind of goes through a process of trying to build empathy with what the stakeholders experiencing about a particular service or issue, and then trying to design solutions collaboratively. Equity-centered design really gets back at that. Equity and inclusion lens is really trying to uncover what biases are built into that process and how can you make sure that you are dealing with those issues as well as with the other issues as well. Next slide, please. And so to give you an example of what the stakeholder engagement framework exercise looks like, it's the idea of trying to figure out how do you want to work with stakeholders and thinking about all the different facets that entails. So do you want to build a partnership? Do you want to have a collaboration? Are you in a consulting capacity? Are you simply seeking feedback or advice? And then based on the type of partnership or work that you want to engage with your stakeholders, that then allows you to determine what kind of activity you want to undertake. So for example, if you are seeking feedback, a focus group might be a great way to go. if you're developing an entire partnership or collaboration, a pilot or something much more robust might be necessary there. So that's just to kind of give you an idea. But it's really this idea of taking kind of a holistic look so that you're looking both internally, kind of library focused approaches, as well as user or stakeholder focused approaches. And with that, I think Brianna is next.
So our fifth section is building a change process team. So knowing that you may have brought this group together already, but maybe this is the point where you're bringing people together. So establishing shared values and collaborative practices. This is something that's critical, getting on the same page as the folks that you're going to be doing this intensive work with. Establishing group norms, meeting facilitation and logistics, all of those things that are pretty basic and standard, or at least we think about them being very basic and standard, but obviously things can fall apart quickly if we don't cover these basic and standard things early on. Thinking about empathy-based approaches to change, understanding and creating psychological safety to have open discussions, because you're going to have to, approach fraught topics as you're going through this work together. So really focusing on trying to make sure you're on the same page, make sure that you have trust within your change process team. And you might already have a great relationship with the folks that you're collaborating with, but it might also be that your group has been brought together and you don't actually know each other very well. And of course, establishing your change process values and practices. So the exercise that we wanted to highlight is we're calling agreeing on shared values. And basically this exercise is all about, we've outlined some example values. You can kind of see, we have a small screenshot in the corner here. You might also choose to add your own, but going through these as an individual and really thinking about what resonates most with you, but then also talking about them as a team. And again, having those conversations, because there are lots of values that we might bring to the team that are equally valid, but are just different. So if we can talk about these, if we can have this open dialogue, we feel that it sets the stage for a really productive collaboration. Next slide. All right, and this is not my slide. So Dani or Cinthya, I think this is one of yours.
Okay, I think it's me. Sorry, I'm not really great on the mute button today. So section 6 is about models of change and transition. And so the committee shared a little bit earlier about, this was one of the places that they came from, and thinking about the need for having a guide or something along these lines is surfacing what these models are, providing resources to find out more about what models of change are. And again, you may be really familiar with some of these already and less familiar with others. So we've provided a list of about 7 different change models in this section where we give you examples. We've got some nice graphics in there about how change is conceptualized in these different frameworks that we felt align also with the values that we brought to this project. So to just say them, appreciative inquiry is one. So focusing on things that you are already doing really well in your institution or in your department, and using that as a basis for your change. Bridges transition model, Lewin's change management model. These are some of those sort of like classic models that include, sort of like beginning stages. Everything is cyclical, of course. The Kubler-Ross change curve, which we thought was an interesting one because it is based on the model created by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that models grief, the grief process. So change can make people feel a lot of those same feelings. And I think we're definitely seeing this with the pandemic and everything that's happening in 2020. There's been some great pieces written recently about that feeling of we're all feeling about change is actually grief. So, we were unfortunately a little bit prescient in selecting this one, I think. the Cotter's theory of change and ecosystems approach to transformational change, and then the ACRL model, all of which are enumerated in this section, and give you suggestions for where to go to learn more about each one. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of different change models. It's not meant to be sort of like the textbook to find out how you might implement a particular change model, but more to just get you thinking about the different ways that people conceptualize change, and maybe pick one to go and investigate a little bit more. I would say like almost no one follows a change model like to the letter, but thinking about how change can affect people during different stages of the change, as well as different people being at different stages of change at the same time, right? So I might feel that I'm a little bit more towards accepting a change, whereas somebody else is maybe a little bit farther back in that process, can be really important for, again, bringing that empathetic approach. So the exercise in this section is to select a change model for your team. Again, not meant to be prescriptive, but just to explore something that seems like it might resonate with you, to think about how that might inform your next steps, inform your iterative process, et cetera.
All right, planning and communicating change. So obviously at this point, you will already have been doing some planning. You'll have been hopefully doing some communicating as well, but we definitely thought that this topic deserved its own section to really unpack and to think through and to share some strategies about. And much like what you've heard from us for the other sections, we didn't want to be overly prescriptive when we're talking about project management. We're aware that, organizations already have some of their own approaches to how projects are managed. And frankly, different organizational cultures just deal with project management in different ways. So while we wanted to share some general guidance, we also wanted to leave a lot of space for individual organizations and project teams to really decide what the best way forward is for you, as long as you have an intentional approach. That was really the main thing that we focused on, having a shared approach that everybody is on board with. We did talk about two sort of documents that we wanted to consider within this realm of project management, those being project charters. So this might also be related closely to like a charge that you might receive for your project team, but really having a document that outlines at a fairly high level, what is the scope of either what you want to do that you might present to your administration, or what your administration is asking you to do. And this also acknowledges that sometimes we are being asked to take on change, and sometimes we're also trying to kickstart a change and gain buy-in. So the change is happening from sort of different levels of an organization. We definitely want to share out that we think it's important, though, to be able to have some documentation that can be pointed to try to get ahead of any misunderstandings, right? Because we can talk about a change, but then some of those key elements or information that once you start coming up with a more detailed project plan, and then somebody says, but hey, you put this in there and this doesn't work for this reason. So we think it's smart to have a broad project charter, get folks on board, then dig into those details, especially related to the timeline, what roles folks are going to have, those types of details. Next slide, please. This is the communication slide, and we could absolutely spend the whole webcast talking about communication, as we all know. And this is something that even those of us who are doing our best, we might make mistakes. We might have, blind spots and areas for improvement. So these are just a few of the strategies that we share, and we spend more time unpacking this in the guide. Communicate clearly. So being as concise, simple, straightforward about the change as you can be, avoiding a lot of jargon unless that's really critical to the planning and unless that's sort of spelled out, again, within your documentation. Creating multiple ways for people to engage and give feedback as the change process unfolds. Not everyone will be comfortable sharing their feedback in the same way. So ideally what you want to do is be really thoughtful about a variety of ways that you can open up your project to that feedback. It might be anonymous, allowing people to not share their names when they're sharing feedback. Maybe people prefer to give their feedback in person and have an opportunity to talk one-on-one with someone who's on the change team. So it really is just thinking about having a few of these different ways that people can engage and then thoughtfully communicating that out so that people feel really invited to do so. Being realistic, building in buffer time. If we know that we have some busy seasons, building in that buffer time so that we're not creating a timeline that ultimately just stresses absolutely everybody out, because there will be delays, there will be things that come up. So, probably with most timelines, we're going to have to adjust them anyway. But starting from a place of not having something that's unrealistic is pretty important. And also, I would say, particularly given levels of burnout right now, people's capacity, also being realistic about bandwidth, in addition to just thinking about time, but thinking about people's bandwidth. This next one I think is really critical. As a project team, make a widely shared commitment to being as transparent about the change process as you're able to be, and prove this through your actions. With the caveat that it's very important for this value to be modeled from your administration. That's really important. We think that, if you're making this commitment to your organization, there are going to be things that you can't share for very real reasons of privacy, confidentiality. But if you are doing your due diligence to not only vocalize this commitment, but show through your actions, through inviting people to give feedback, through sharing, outputs from the project team, communicating out what's going on, then people will be understanding when you share back that, for reasons of confidentiality, we're not actually able to disclose that at this time. And along those same lines, make a plan for acknowledging feedback that has been given at some point in your change process. So if you're asking for all this feedback, hopefully that's coming from a genuine place. We certainly encourage it to come from a genuine place, but you might start to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm asking for all this feedback, and now we're not doing anything with this feedback. We've intentionally decided that we need to move in this other direction, despite the feedback that this group or this person is giving us. So we just advise that you have a plan for acknowledging that feedback, whether you're saying, thank you for giving this feedback, we're incorporating it in this way, or you're saying, thank you for giving this feedback. We've decided as a project team for this reason that we're moving in this other direction. But that will just help build trust within your organization and honestly make it feel like it was a genuine ask for the feedback. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, the exercise that we wanted to share is just creating a really, really simple communication plan. I think some of what gets ahead of us creating project plans or communication plans is that we're thinking, oh my goodness, this is a really overwhelming thing to do. There's a lot to consider. Where do I even start? So we really liked this very basic method that we adapted from the UC San Diego Library, where really just start thinking about who are those stakeholders, internal, external, that you would want to reach out to. How are you going to do it? What do those updates look like? And at what frequency? So you can imagine that you can just sort of start drafting this out working on this with your project team, and you can sort of continuously build on it and refine it. And then pretty soon you have a decent communication plan that you can look to and kind of schedule out. Next slide, please. And the final section in our guide is on evaluating and sustaining change. So setbacks are going to happen. We talk about some ways that you can focus on maintaining trust, maintaining momentum as change unfolds, perhaps in different ways than anticipated, and how this can really contribute to the resiliency of your organization. To assess your change, was your change successful? Was it not successful? We suggest looking to measurable outcomes-based goals. We talk a lot about what that might look like. So what kind of inputs and outputs, and how can you look to those elements that are measurable that have been part of your change process to really assess the success of whether you met the outcomes that you wanted to meet when you set out to create this change. But then I would argue, perhaps more importantly, we also have a focus on reviewing the process, which is really in line with a lot of what's baked into this entire guide. So we suggest conducting a post-process review within your change team, where you're really surfacing what went well, what could have gone better, what should we keep doing, what should we stop doing. Depending on the dynamics, this might be an in-person discussion, this might be an anonymous survey or a way that you're collecting this information. But we think it's really powerful within an organization to start building out these post-process review documentation, because maybe you're able to actually surface some issues within the culture as well, or within particular elements of the process that are actually common across different changes that folks are trying to make. Next slide, please. So we just threw a lot at you. We walked through a fairly long guide, and we gave you little snippets of the sections and some of the exercises and a lot of topics related to change. But we wanted to kind of take a step back, zoom out a little bit, and talk about some of what we hope will come out of this guide. So we are hoping that this guide will help us reflect on change as individuals, as teams, as organizations. We are hoping that we will start talking more about our missteps. So we're going to do things wrong. If we're trying, and we should be, things are going to happen that are failures, and we're going to have to learn from one another and gently hold each other accountable. Striving for a new focus on process, not just outcomes, which should ring true based on what I shared in the last slide. But really thinking about, we all want a great outcome. We all want to say, yes, this change was successful. But frankly, sometimes there are things that are out of our control that will mean that despite all of the good work that we did, a change is not successful. So don't we want to be able to say, wow, the process really strengthened, our relationships within the library. And let's develop a community of practice that openly addresses not just what changes we're making. We love to go out to the conferences and say, hey, we did this cool thing, look how amazing it is. But it's much rarer to actually talk about how we got there and what we did. And again, sort of unpeeling what worked and what didn't work, and being a bit vulnerable and talking about those elements. So the guide just came out last week, and we know that some of you may have checked it out already. Some people may not have looked at it yet, but we really also want to open up the conversation to ask what's missing from the guide. What would you add to the conversation? And we really want to reiterate that we're interested in learning from everyone as well. Next slide, please. Very briefly, before we jump over to our Q&A, where we hope you'll ask us lots of questions. I see some coming in on the chat. We do have some future hopes for this project. And one of those is that we hope to convene a community of practice, probably in spring 2021, where cohorts of teams across different libraries can actually work together, support one another, talk through some of these not very straightforward decisions that you might have to make about change. There's a lot that's to be determined, including the platform and how exactly this might work. But we certainly hope that it will be an opportunity for people to connect in thinking about change. And we will actually be sending out at some point a survey from ACRL that gauges your interest in this cohort and also your ideas. We really want to hear from you. How would this be most useful to you in practice? Next slide, please. And with that, we would love to segue to Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone. That was very interesting for me, and I've read the guide a number of times. So I very much appreciate your time. I do want to circle back to a question that came in earlier on building a trusting environment. So many of these strategies require a larger conversation about change, what people want from the change, what people fear of the change. What are your ideas, strategies for developing a trusting environment where that conversation could be facilitated in a meaningful way? And I know there's some good discussion on this in the chat as well.
So I'm happy to jump in and start off with the answer. So I think, again, the more we can, the more the organization can make these discussions explicit and bring them out in the open in whatever way that works for the particular library in question, the better. And then that way, hopefully everyone understands kind of what the issues are going into some of these processes, and then you can develop a path forward together for how you agree to move forward together, both in terms of values as well as behaviors and activities. And then hopefully everyone can hold each other and themselves accountable and provide feedback, constructive feedback as things are evolving. But I think, and this is kind of true of a lot of different elements, not just about change, but the more these conversations can be explicit and trying to sort of minimize the, kind of side conversations or side issues and really bring them out and addressing them head on and addressing them in as open a manner as possible. I think that has a lot to do with how successful some of this work can be. And Dani and Brianna, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the emphases throughout the guide is to be as transparent as possible as a trust building measure. So I think a lot of times during change processes, for example, we will solicit input from folks and it won't make it into the final change and there's really no follow-up to why or why not something happened. So that's an opportunity to build trust when you've asked folks for their labor, you've asked them to provide their ideas, and if you don't use them, to hold yourself accountable to tell folks why. So that I think is a really strong way to build trust, is to not just gloss over things that maybe make you more uncomfortable or that challenge you, but to actually go back and talk about that more.
Great, thank you both. Here's another question that was touched on in the chat. Academic libraries are confronting white supremacy and systemic racism as a needed change in libraries and in higher ed. In creating this guide, what checks did you use to make sure this guide is not replicating systemic racism? What input from Black library professionals was incorporated?
So I'll take a first pass at answering that, and I would definitely invite the other authors and the committee to jump in as well. So thank you for that question, first of all. That's definitely, a good challenging question. So I will say that as we were writing this, as we were putting this together, like we did explicitly think about some of these issues. So we, for example, looked at the checklist about white supremacy culture in the workplace. So thinking about things like arbitrary deadlines and a feeling of urgency, creating a feeling of urgency that isn't really there. So that's, for example, why you won't find that theory of change in this guide. However, we didn't have a robust review process from folks outside of the committee. And so I don't believe that we have any librarians of color who have commented on this guide. And that is definitely something that could be an improvement. And we would love to think about a way to make that happen. It is Creative Commons licensed. So folks can take it and make those changes that they see fit for themselves. But if you have suggestions or folks who you think we should talk to review it, and maybe we do another round of consideration, I think we would definitely be open to that. But I definitely invite my colleagues here to comment as well.
I know that we actually, and Mark could speak to it, but I know that when we spoke to our original SMEs, there wasn't diversity in the SMEs that we spoke to, but where they were all had in common is they were all kind of exemplary leaders. So we didn't go about the interviews with them focusing at all on their diversity, but there wasn't diversity in their initial interviews with SMEs.
Yeah, that's true. But if you look at our 6 white faces, you know that we are the main focus here. Our SMEs, the people we interviewed, I interviewed an African-American woman, for example. And so that kind of, like Liz said, an exemplary leader. And so that fostered some conversation, but ultimately we did not have an outside feedback process like Dani was saying. It was pretty much the 3 authors and the 3 committee members, plus Jill earlier on and Dane earlier on as well. So pretty much 8 of us looking at this process, and so that has not happened at this point.
So I guess I would again just say that I don't necessarily think that we have to consider this a finished document, and I think that we can learn from this question maybe, and we could ask for additional review at this point. And if you have suggestions of folks, colleagues of color and Black colleagues that you think would be excellent folks to have their perspective included, we would love to hear those suggestions and then talk about moving forward with that.
Thank you all for that. And I agree with your approach, Dani. I don't think we feel this is finished, and there's a phase 2, and this project is going to live for a while. So we would love to hear from everyone in the community, and we'll make lots of space for that.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I just made a note in the comments, but I would absolutely agree with everything that Dani said. And Jade, thank you for your comment. But perhaps this is also something that more broadly with ACRL resources, there could be an additional level or layer of review. It's definitely giving me a lot to think about.
Yes, we have lots of options, and I think it's really exciting where all of this can go. And it looks like we're just about at time. Any last questions, please put them into the chat now and we will get to them. And thanks again for our fantastic presenters, the members of New Roles and Changing Landscapes who conceived of this project and saw it through to the end. We're so excited to have worked with you all on this.
Well, and an extra special thanks also, can I just say, to Erin, who has been an amazing editor and support throughout this process. So Erin, you rock. We appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much. You've made my job very easy.
I feel like we've birthed something here, and it will grow, and it will grow up and mature.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. And Erin and I know from that initial conversation we had where we were so excited, I'm going to echo what Erin said at the very beginning. I am so excited to see this come through it to its completion, and I'm really hoping we see communities of practice built around these moving forward.
Mhm. Hey, I think we are all set.
All right.
Thank you again, everyone, for your time. This was great. I really meant it. I have read the guide a number of times, and this was illuminating for me. So I very much appreciate it. And someone mentioned in the chat, maybe putting the slides up on the site. So we can discuss that separately if that's something you're interested in doing. I know you've put a ton of work into this.